Welcome to Knife Thoughts. This video is going to be a review of this knife, and this is the Finch Devil's Finger. So this knife was sent to me by Finch Knife Company. I got to talk with Spencer of Finch Knife at Blade Show this year, but I've been following Finch Knife Company since really they first got started because I was able to take part in a pass around of their first model, the Runtley. And the Runtley is something that I was interested in because, like a lot of Finch's models, it was inspired by not necessarily a vintage pattern or a traditional knife pattern, like, for example, the Finch Buffalo Tooth, which I did a review of recently, which is kind of a modern rendition of the elephant toe pattern, but rather the Runtley was inspired by vintage fishing lures. So I think that that's really cool, and I really appreciate that they do that with a lot of their knife designs. So when they sent the Devil's Finger, I was kind of interested to see what the inspiration was behind this knife. Now, before I get into that, I just want to talk about the knife itself. So this is a liner lock flipper. You can see that it's very smooth. It came very smooth. I haven't had to adjust it or anything like that. It came well centered, and their knives, tend to be really of a high quality. I think that they do a lot of quality control themselves and make sure that the knives that they are sending out to their dealers are, up to par. So not surprised to see that it's made really well. It flips well, it locks up well, no forward and back when locked, and no side to side when unlocked. Just generally a really well made knife on the action. And then the handles, which my version is a green micarta here, are kind of rounded. You get a little bit of rounding, a little bit of machining, so it feels nice and comfortable in the hand. And then the blade is a really acute spear point. And so that's really where the Devil's Finger comes in, I think. On the website, they talk about it's a knife that is pretty thin, pretty easy to carry, but you get a good point, a good blade on it, so that if you need it, you have it. Now, for me, I use this knife for just general EDC, and it worked pretty well. It is in 154 cm, which is a classic American steel. It's not a super steel at this point, but it definitely works well, and it's relatively easy to sharpen. So held an edge, perfectly fine. Not like, again, the super high fancy steels like, whatever the fancy steels now, M390, 20 CV, Magna Cut is the most fancy, or the most trendy, I guess I should say. But it's gonna really be fine for your EDC tasks, in my opinion. Now, if you're cutting cardboard all day, every day, probably just use a utility knife. So I think for normal EDC, 154 cm is a great choice. I have used it a lot. Actually hadn't for a long time, but then recently, starting with a ProTech knife, I've just seemed to get several knives in 154 cm. So I've gotten really familiar with it, and I think it is a very, very usable steel. The grind seems pretty nicely done. It is pretty thin. It's not a full flat grind. It's not a full grind here, so it's not the tallest grind out there, but it is pretty thin behind the edge. Seems to cut really well, and again, kind of the point is the point. It's a very pointy point. My cousin kind of thought that was ridiculous on the unboxing video that I did of this, that I said it was a pointy point. What other type of point is there? But it's an especially pointy point, we'll say. And I do like the drawn swedge here at the top, and I actually really like the look of the finish here, this stonewash dark finish. I think it goes really well with the green. So I like the looks of it, and like I say, I couldn't really find any particular traditional pattern of knife that it was inspired by, and I didn't see anything, on Finch's website about it being inspired by something like how the Runtley is inspired by vintage fishing lures. But when I look at this knife, it really, for some reason, to me, seems to look like an old kind of, not muscle car, but the even older things that had those kind of curved back ends and the really kind of long front ends. I am not a car person, so I can't even really tell you what type of car it is that I'm thinking about, but you know, kind of before the muscle cars of the 60s or 70s or whenever they were, there were those very almost like Art Deco looking cars with the hard curve, or the curves, and then the kind of hard lines elsewhere, and then the really long fronts. For some reason, this knife reminds me of that, and it makes me think of like a devil figure in like a real fancy like 20s or 30s, probably 30s type waistcoat suit, driving a real fancy big car, and that's what this reminds me of. So you know, maybe I'm letting my imagination kind of run wild with that, but that is what it makes me think of. I'm sure that, you know, whoever at Finch Knives designed this knife wasn't thinking of specifically that when they designed it, but that's the interesting thing about knives, is that they really can kind of evoke a very personal response, you know, depending on each person looking at it. So for me, you know, it looks like kind of a 30s Art Deco car, kind of in that theme, that aesthetic. So that's what it looks like to me. I think it would look even more like that if it had like maybe a blue and white color theme to it, something like that. You know, again, I'm not doing a great job of defining exactly what I'm talking about, but you know, that's what I think about when I look at this knife. I think it's a very good general use knife. Like most really like not completely out there knife designs, it's going to work well for your EDC tasks. It you know, it's made well, it's easy to flip, it's easy to close, it feels good in the hand with this nice simple straight line of the handle, nice simple straight line on the back, and then the nice curve so that it doesn't stick into your hand. I think this works really well in a pinch grip. You know, certainly it works well in a hammer style grip too, but in a pinch grip where you are pushing the back of the handle into your hand, it feels really good, being that it has that rounded back kind of end of the butt. So really, I've enjoyed this knife. I think it's an interesting knife. Sometimes I ask, you know, the designers or the owners of company, like, what is the inspiration for this knife? And sometimes I don't, to try to come up with my own thing like I did for this one. So I do want to ask and see if there was a particular kind of inspiration for this knife, but you know, for this one I just decided to come up with my own thoughts on it. So this is not a huge knife. I wanted to give you a couple quick comparisons. Here it is to two other green knives just for fun. This is an Ontario Rat 1. You can see the Rat 1 is a good bit larger. This is a Kershaw Blur. Again, the Blur is a good bit bigger. So you can see that the Devil's Finger is a more EDC sized knife. I'll show it to you in comparison to the Civivi Elementum. So it's much more Elementum sized. I would say it's very similar in size, maybe slightly longer than the Elementum. So very much an EDC sized knife that you can, you know, carry easily and still have a very pointy point, as I called it. So I've enjoyed getting to check out this knife. Make sure you check out Finch Knife Company. I'll have a link to the knife in the description. Check out my other videos and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this type of video. Make sure you click the bell and select all so you know when I post new videos. Check out my other social media. I am on Instagram and Facebook at Knife Thoughts, and my website, knifethoughts.com, where I post articles on knives like this and knife related topics. And last but not least, as always, don't forget to go out and do good.